Chapter 3, The Roots of Jazz. Do you know anything about how jazz began? Background behind it? In 1987, Congress passed a resolution declaring jazz a valuable national American treasure. It's also called America's classical music. On the basic level, the qualities that mark jazz as different from other musical genres stem directly from its folk origins, which are African American. So, number one, it is important to describe jazz as America's classical music because we can't really claim a lot of the popular or great classical music of the past couple hundred years. A lot of that is from the German tradition, European music that we listen to. Jazz is uniquely American, and that is different and should be valuable. So your book then goes on to say this. If it is uniquely from African American folk culture, we can therefore make the straightforward yet provocative assertion, jazz is an African American music. So, your book just says that sentence. How do you feel about that? Does that seem a little odd to you? Can jazz just be for one group of people? Can music in general be for one group of people? Or does it have to be for everybody? Good question. One thing that's completely unique about jazz is that the musicians can be any gender, can be race, any color, ethnicity, height, weight, whatever you want to come up with. It doesn't matter what you look like, you can play jazz. Miles Davis, a famous trumpet player, once said, "If a jazz musician can play, I don't give a damn if he was green and had red breath." John Steinbeck once said, "Let a filthy kid, unknown, unheard of, and unbacked sit in, and if he can do it, he is recognized and accepted instantly." Do you know of any other field where this is true? Take, for example, classical music. When you view the people on stage, what do they look like? Typically, they are white males. Jazz, it doesn't matter what you look like, what your gender is, how tall you are, anything. As long as you can keep up, you're accepted. Doesn't matter. And I think this is specifically important when we get into the roots of jazz and everything that has happened to the people that are performing jazz. That jazz is so welcoming despite all of the awful things that happen. So keep that in mind. So moving on from there, your book talks about the difference between ethnicity and race. Now, you might feel very strongly one way or the other about this, so hold on to your horses. African American is usually construed as an indication of race, the physical characteristics of skin color we inherit through our genes, but also tells us about ethnicity. Ethnicity helps to explain how culture makes us who we are. Race can't be changed, and ethnicity can. Ethnicity is learned behavior. What do you think about that? Is race different from ethnicity? Now, this is not something that people typically talk about, so it's perhaps a new concept. And it's okay to disagree with the textbook. It's making a very provocative case. So, if race is the color of your skin, how you were born, what your DNA says, and that can't be changed, there has to be some aspect of you that can be changed. So your book is arguing that ethnicity is learned behavior. So take, for example, you are born in the United States, but then your family moves to Africa, and you spend your entire life in Africa, or you spend your entire life in Ireland, or something like that. You can potentially learn all about the culture that you're living in, and you might view that as your culture, depending on where you are, because that's all you've ever known. Even if you were born somewhere else, you could adapt all of the aspects of the culture that you live in. So the argument is that ethnicity is learned behavior. Race is what you're born with that you can't change. Okay, so moving on from there, we acquire ethnicity in our youth unconsciously. Our cultural habits become second nature. Because of technology, the primary way diverse peoples have shared their culture is through music. So here comes the big statement by your book. Through jazz, the whole country, the whole world becomes more African American. Now, when I teach this in person, a lot of people in class are a little uncomfortable by that statement, and rightfully so. I don't think that your book is trying to say that if you listen to jazz, all of a sudden you can change your skin color, or that you can understand the plight of a culture. I don't think it's arguing that at all. I think what your book is trying to say that you can understand more about a culture if you listen to the music from the culture. And in our case, if our music, jazz, is taken from specific folk origins or beginning important aspects of a culture, would that help us understand more about African American culture? Maybe, hypothetically. So again, I don't think your book is trying to argue that you become African American by listening to jazz, but I think it is useful and a good thing to understand more about a culture. I think that makes us better humans, better people on the planet. But feel free to disagree with this statement that your book makes. You'll have an opportunity to talk about that in the discussion board as we go along. So, moving on from there. Many aspects of jazz are uniquely African American. Folk rhythm. Polyrhythm, so the idea of multiple rhythms going on at the same time. Call and response. We'll talk specifics about that later. We have blue notes and we have timbre variation. Timbre variation, remember timbre is the quality of sound or tone color, so the way that we change the quality of sound. So why do we care? Why do we learn about folk aspects? Well, we can understand more about a culture by studying these elements. Every culture has a folk tradition. These are typically based on everyday life. It could be a narration of what goes on your daily life. It's typically passed down through oral tradition, meaning from like what the mother would sing to the child when they went to sleep or something like that. So it tells us about basic everyday life of a people group. Helpful to understand. There are 4 basic ones for African American folk culture that influence jazz. They are ballads, work songs, field holler, and spirituals. Ballads are retelling of local history, typically very lengthy. Work songs and field hollers thrived on the railroads, anywhere music was needed to pace manual labor. So something that you could sing that could keep you going, keep the pace or a certain tempo or fastness of whatever it was you were doing. And that could have the sounds of instruments, meaning like tools, in the background as you're doing something. If you're working on the railroad, you might hear hitting metal or thrashing of corn or something like that. Field holler typically takes place in a field and it's not very structured. It's kind of this loose way of singing that you're just narrating or talking about either what you're doing or your experiences. It's not structured and refined. It's more of just as it comes to you. And the 4th one is spirituals. A lot of our jazz musicians spend a lot of time in church, so we're learning about music by attending church, getting those spirituals from there. So the ballads in particular, here are some examples. The blasting of a railroad tunnel inspired John Henry, who was a hard-muscled steel driving hero who's fighting a losing battle against modern machinery. So this story about someone else. It's not something that you're telling that happened to you personally. It is about someone else. Stagger Lee, another example. The taste for boasting and exaggeration with its emphasis on sexual exploits and one-upmanship is still prominent in what type of music today? Hip-hop. Hip-hop stems directly from ballads, African American folk culture. Moving on from ballads, we have work songs and field holler. So like I said, it's an unstructured way of singing. You are just kind of talking about what's going on. You're moving your voice up and down. It doesn't really have a strict tempo or speed that you're singing. or a rhythm that repeats over and over again, it's unpredictable. So an example of what that would sound like would be this. So you can hopefully hear the sounding tools in the background singing together. That one has some repetition that makes more sense as a melody, but there are others that don't have some symbols of a melody whatsoever. Field holler. So moving on from there, we have spirituals. Spirituals passed on orally from parents to children, usually sung in churches. It turned into gospel music in the 1920s, which has impacted a lot of American music, many different styles. But most of our jazz musicians learned what they knew about music from being in church, oral tradition aspects. So last thing to talk about with this origin screencast is this very famous piece called the Buzzard Lope. Now, just speaking strictly about the title, what do you think it's about? Any ideas? How about if we just watch it? What do you think it's about? So that seems kind of odd, right? We have this guy who's circling around this towel, jumping over the towel, and then there's this group of people standing around in a circle with one person that's singing the main melody and then everyone else is responding. So this is an example of call and response. The leader is singing something and then the rest of the group responds in kind of like an echo sort of thing. So we have call and response there. Now, what do you think the towel represents? Towel is actually representing a body. So when an African American would die, they didn't always get proper burial. Sometimes their bodies were just thrown into a field if they got sick or something like that. So then the man is representing the buzzard, or the birds that would fly around and pick apart at the dead bodies in the field. Kind of devastating to think about. But the joy part of the song is that the people are singing about how no matter what happens to them, what happens to their body, their Savior, their God will take care of them and protect them. Even through all of this hardship, their God will protect them.